Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Thomas, and I am an Energy Assistance Program Specialist from the Operations Branch of the Office of Community Services Division of Energy Assistance. On behalf of OCS, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, providing a step-by-step overview of the fiscal year 2019 household report. Today's webinar will have two presenters, Melissa Torgerson and Dan Bausch of Apprise. Today's webinar has three purposes. First, the webinar will provide an introduction to the annual household report long form, which state grantees and select territory grantees are required to complete each year as part of our federal LIHEAP reporting requirements. Second, the webinar will provide an in-depth overview of the household report, reviewing each item line by line and the steps to report accurately according to the instructions. Finally, the webinar will highlight key things to remember and to keep in mind to avoid those common reporting issues. The audience for this webinar, so you all know, is for new LIHEAP coordinators and staff or contractors who have not worked on the household report before, as well as coordinators and staff that would like to review the requirements in greater detail to understand all of the instructions. This coming Tuesday, there's going to be another webinar on completing the household report, but that 30-minute webinar is meant to provide some reminders for staff that are more experienced with completing the report. So this is a good time if you're on the wrong webinar to come back Tuesday. Regarding the fiscal year 2019 report, HHS announced the due date in our July action transmittal that described the model plan application for fiscal year 2020 LIHEAP funding. And an action transmittal about the fiscal year 2019 household report is also expected to be published soon. So you can expect that in the next few weeks. We hope that this training webinar is a valuable tool for you, and we thank you for your time today. So with that, I will introduce Melissa Torgerson.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Today's webinar is 90 minutes long, and we're going to spend time, as Kate mentioned, reviewing key information regarding the household report. The slides for this webinar are available now under the handout section in the GoToWebinar sidebar. So if you have that, you can take a look and download it now. The webinar is also being recorded and will be published on the ACF YouTube channel if you want to go back and listen again. The webinar is pretty long and pretty detailed, and so we're encouraging people to ask questions as you have them by typing them into the GoToWebinar Question Box. You'll notice that we have numbers on each slide, so if you want to reference a particular slide, you can do that in your question that you write down. Submitted questions will be reviewed and responded to at the question breaks. If they're very particular to your state or if we run out of time, you'll get an email from Apprise to respond to your question. You can click the raise your hand button during the break to be called on to ask a question over the phone, although we really recommend that you write your question out. It seems to go a lot more smoothly. On the next slide, in case some of you aren't terribly familiar with GoToWebinar, this on the left-hand side, you'll see a box. This is where you're going to find the handouts, where you can ask a question to staff or raise your hand. And if for some reason you can't see it, you should be able to see this little tiny one, and you can click the orange arrow button, and that will expand your navigation bar. As I mentioned before, we're going over quite a bit of detail in this webinar, and I don't know if you're anything like me, it's a lot of information to kind of try to soak in at once. And so what Apprise has done here is kind of given you key points of the outline that or the webinar that we're walking through, so that if you go back to revisit the slides later, you can quickly find those sections that you may have particular questions about. One of the things I want to emphasize is that we've put a lot of text on the PowerPoint slides, which I know breaks every PowerPoint rule out there, but it's really important for us to give you a lot of detailed information that you can have at your fingertips after the webinar, or that you can even pass on to, say, your IT folks or your analysts that help you put together the report. With that, we'd like to start with a poll. And so Hopefully y'all are on your toes and can participate. We'd like you to select a response to the following question. How confident are you that you understand how to complete the household report? And your options are very confident, somewhat confident, not too confident, and not at all confident. And so if you all could take a moment and select how you feel about this, that would be great. And Jorge, when you're ready, you can show the results.
Okay, last 5 seconds if anyone hasn't voted.
Great. So it looks like about a quarter of you are very confident. The bulk of you are somewhat. So our hope is obviously that you would leave this webinar maybe having answers to particular questions you're not feeling super great about. And then for the not too and not at all confident, our hope is that this will make you a little bit more confident with the understanding that we're here to help if you have questions beyond this webinar. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to the next section, which is what we're going to start with the basics of the household report. And I'd like to introduce Dan Bausch from Apprise.
Hi, everyone. This is Dan Bausch. I'm part of the LIHEAP Technical Assistance Team at Apprise. I'm just going to start by giving you some context about the history of the household report. The household report has been an annual report that's been conducted since the 1980s. The real purpose of the report is that it allows OCS to be able to report information from all grantees to Congress about LIHEAP outcomes, which is something that is discussed in the LIHEAP statute. When you submit your household report, the data are published in the LIHEAP report to Congress. They're published in the LIHEAP data warehouse that you can access on the performance management website. And that information is also used by HHS to respond to inquiries from the administration or Congress. There's two main types of data that are reported in the household report. The first is you're reporting information on the households that received LIHEAP assistance during the fiscal year. And then the second is you're reporting on the number of households that applied for LIHEAP assistance during the fiscal year. There are two different versions of the report for state grantees and for select territory grantees. There's a long form version. That's the version we're focused on today. And for tribal grantees, there is a short form version. Each year when grantees submit their model plan in September, as part of the application process for funding, they're also asked to submit a preliminary household report, and that can use estimated data. And then the focus of this webinar is on the submission of your final report, which has to use non-estimated data. For the fiscal year 2019 report, the due date is December 16th. We wanted to provide an overview of how the household report relates with some of the other required reports that you submit each year to HHS. Prior to a fiscal year beginning, the first step is to submit a model plan, and the model plan indicates the types of assistance that you're intending to provide during the upcoming fiscal year. Once the fiscal year is over, the household report is submitted typically in December, as it is this year, and that's where you report on the actual number of households that were assisted or applied for each different type of LIHEAP assistance that you provided during the past fiscal year. The performance data form, which we'll also be providing training on in the coming months, asks you to provide in the first module called the Grantee Survey information about the different sources of funding you received and the different ways you use those LIHEAP funds, as well as the average benefit you provided the households. And then finally, the performance measures, Module 2, is where you report on energy burden information for the households that were assisted and on the number of occurrences where LIHEAP helped maintain or restore home energy service. So the main question for people who've worked on the household report in the past is, are there any changes to the 2019 household report? The answer is no, there are no changes to the report, and the requirements are the same as those for last year's fiscal year 2018 report. As Kate mentioned, HHS is expecting to publish a specific action transmittal soon for the FY19 report. But if you need the instructions and want to view the instructions, you can go to this link here for last year's 2018 household report. And we also encourage you to look back at emails and any documentation you have from last year's household report to help you in preparing this year's. Now we're going to talk about the general reporting rules for the household report.
All right, so these are basic, some people would say common sense, but I want to make sure that we emphasize them because we do see issues each year with this report, and so it's really important that you report data according to the official instructions. In other words, there may be times where you feel like your state has a better handle or definition for what the data should look like than what we're instructing you to do, but it's really important in order to get a consistent report that you follow the instructions. We'll emphasize this several times throughout the webinar, but the notes section is your best friend. Explain any unique program features or nuances in the notes section. We'll give you some examples of how to do that throughout this webinar. We want you to provide a consistent report with final data, and when we talk about consistency, you'll hear that throughout the remainder of the webinar. It should be consistent with other reports you're submitting, including your model plan. And it should have final data. So as Dan mentioned, many of you turn in estimated data earlier in the year with your state plan. This report, when you submit it, should have final data. And finally, investigating and addressing issues or questions from the review of your report in a timely fashion is expected. A prize is contracted to go through and check the reports, identify potential errors or questions, and they will reach out to you if they have those questions. And it's anticipated and expected that you'll respond back in a timely manner by looking into and confirming or clarifying those errors. As we all know, LIHEAP is a block grant, which means all of you have very diverse and unique programs and do things just a little bit differently. And this makes reporting kind of a challenge. OCS has to report consistent information to Congress, and the household report is designed so that OCS can report uniform information on households that receive LIHEAP assistance. So as we mentioned before, it's really important for you or the people in your office who are putting together this report to review the instructions for guidance on how to correctly report each item, and to contact your OCS liaison or a prize when encountering challenges reporting according to the instructions. We get a lot of people that say, I have this program element that doesn't quite fit in the box, and so where would I report that? Don't sit at your desk and bang your head against the wall, trying to figure out where it goes. Just pick up the phone and call and say, I have this unique program component, not quite sure where it goes in this report, and we'll help you figure it out. So some examples of where people may intentionally or unintentionally kind of forego the official instructions. Many of you have program years that differ from the federal fiscal year, which is October 1st to September 30th. But for this report, we want you to report on data for the federal fiscal year. So for some of you, that means you're going to be reporting on data for across your own state program years. The other piece is that grantees have all kinds of different reporting systems, and some of you report based on individual benefits provided, but grantees are instructed to report information on the number of households served rather than the number of benefits issued. So it's important to pay attention to kind of your units of analysis that you use in your own system and make sure that you're actually using the ones that are in the instructions. So this, I mentioned earlier that the notes section is your best friend. For For those of you who have done this in the past, you know that if there are any questions that come up or any inconsistencies, a prize will call and talk to you. You can avoid this phone call by adding notes that will clarify any discrepancies or inconsistencies for a prize so that they don't need to call you. And so anytime you get a warning, any kind of piece of, when you're sticking something in a field that maybe isn't quite, doesn't quite fit, or you're not sure if it quite fits, please put an explanation in the notes section. It'll help us to understand. And it's very important, not just for us to understand what we're looking at, but OCS uses these notes in the tables and footnotes in the report to Congress. So it's very important that you give as much clarification as possible. So here's some examples. As I mentioned, we'd provide you with some examples. Some of you always, before you give any other type of assistance, a household must receive heating assistance. So in this case, a grantee would report the same number of households served with heating assistance that they would put into any type of LIHEAP assistance. And so what we would want to see is a note that indicates this. A grantee receives a warning message alerting them that the number of households they reported for cooling assistance is substantially different from the prior year. If once the grantee confirms the data are correct, if you've gone in and said, yes, we know it's a lot less, this number is correct, we'd want to see an explanation in the notes section. Either we didn't have as much funding, we didn't serve as many households, whatever it is, just to confirm that you saw the error, you've double-checked the data, and it is correct.
The third rule is about providing a consistent report with final data. So the household report is not an audit report. It's a report that asks you to use the best information available at the time of reporting from your data reporting system. You're expected to be able to use your data reporting system to identify and count the households for each type of assistance, and as we'll talk about soon, an unduplicated count across different types of assistance. And to help you with this process, there are data validations and checks that OCS has been conducting for a number of years. The first is that when you enter your report in OLDC, there's warning and error messages that will appear when you go to validate and submit your report, and those are meant to alert you to any simple issues like typos or other issues where you may need to look into your data. And then the second type of check that occurs, as Melissa mentioned, is that a prize reviews the reports and conducts some manual comparisons and tests. So this is an example of the kind of information you need from your data reporting system to complete the household report. We have created a template that we provide to grantees if you're interested that shows the different data elements you would need. You can see information here on vulnerable members in the household, on the type of benefits that households are receiving, as well as the number in the household. The fourth reporting rule is to investigate and address issues or questions. So you are expected, if there's a question that comes up or an issue during the review of your household report, to be able to verify your data by reviewing the data reporting system, and you're expected to be able to correct any issues that are found, or to provide more information. This is something we'll talk about more during the coming slides, but the general idea here is to be able to use your data reporting system to check information if something may potentially be a mistake or there might need to be an additional note to clarify. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to start going into the household report, and we're going to start with section 1, which is the number of assisted households. Section 1 asks you to report the number of households that receive LIHEAP assistance for each different type of LIHEAP assistance, across types of LIHEAP assistance. It asks you to report on bill payment assistance, and there's a category if your state provides nominal payments as part of the SNAP partnership. You're going to see this image throughout the webinar. This is a picture of Section 1 of the household report, and we're going to start going line by line, talking about the information that you would report on each line. So we're first looking at heating assistance, which is line 1. So heating assistance is any household that receives LIHEAP assistance to help pay for a share of a household's heating bills using funds that are allocated for regular heating assistance. There is some variation across the states. For some states, heating assistance may include households that receive expedited heating assistance, which we're going to talk about soon. And a small number of states also provide repair and replacement on a non-emergency basis that would be counted here. But in general, heating assistance is a LIHEAP assistance to pay a share of a household's heating bill. So the reporting period here is households that received heating assistance during fiscal year 2019, which is from October 1st, 2018 to September 30th, 2019. So when you're identifying those households, you need to remember if your state operates on a different program year, that you want to select the households that receive their benefit during that fiscal year period. There are a small number of grantees that do not have a separate crisis component with separate crisis funds, but they provide expedited heating assistance to households that are in a crisis situation. And if you're one of those states and you're familiar with what I'm talking about, the reporting instructions are to report those under heating assistance and under crisis assistance. If you have a separate crisis assistance component, then this slide is not relevant for you. If you do provide expedited heating assistance, you're asked to provide a note that indicates that and indicates the number of households that receive the expedited assistance. And there is a field in the model plan that asks if you provide crisis assistance as a separate component, fast track, or other. So that should also be indicated in your model plan. So what if a household received multiple heating assistance benefits during fiscal year 2019? The focus of the household report is on the number of unique households that receive assistance for each category. So if your data reporting system is tracking at the benefit level, you want to make sure that you have a way to identify households and to be able to count each household only once, even if they received multiple heating assistance benefits. So this slide is a helpful thing to provide to any staff that are helping with your data reporting. Here is a visual example of this. If you look on the left side, there are 3 different households: household A, household B, household C. And they're each receiving different types of assistance and different number of benefits for each type. Household A got heating assistance 3 times during the fiscal year. Household B received heating assistance once. If you look down at the bottom at that last row, that's the unduplicated number of households that received each type of assistance. So the number you would report for heating assistance is 2 households, because household A and household B each got heating assistance. You would not want to report 4 because it's 4 benefits, but it's only 2 households. So throughout the household report, we'll be talking about reporting the unduplicated count of households. As I mentioned earlier, some grantees provide equipment repair and replacement that's done on a non-emergency basis. And if you're a state that does this, this slide may be helpful. You can also reach out to us with specific questions you may have. But if you do provide that type of assistance, you want to make sure to remember that unduplicated count issue we talked about previously, and that you're not reporting households more than once if they received a regular heating assistance benefit to help pay a share of their heating bill, and they also received repair services, for example, that were done on a non-emergency basis using heating assistance funds. This is another example of where including a note can be helpful, and again, you can always reach out to us if you have questions about counting any equipment repair and replacement services. One question that comes up regularly is if a household was served in the current fiscal year with heating assistance, but the funding that they were served with was from the prior year, should the household be included in the household report? And the answer is yes. For the household report, any household that received a heating assistance benefit during fiscal year 2019 would be counted on the heating assistance line. If there is a particular situation related to how your funding from the previous year was used, you can include it in the notes. Now this slide's going to talk about households being served with LIHEAP and with other funds that you may provide to your households. If a household received any LIHEAP assistance, it should be counted in the household report in the appropriate line for that type of assistance. But if you have another form of assistance, such as a state assistance program that helps households with their heating expenses, you want to exclude households that only received your state assistance from your household report. So the focus of the household report is reporting households that received assistance from LIHEAP funding. As I mentioned earlier, the household report you're expected to use final data from your data reporting system when you submit the report by the December 16th due date. So you're expected to use actual data. And then once you've updated your report from the preliminary report you submitted in September, you want to make sure to select no to the boxes asking if you use estimated figures. So you should verify and uncheck all of those boxes prior to submitting your final report this December. And now Melissa's going to look at line 2, cooling assistance.
Great. So we're to line 2 of 7 lines. So things will move a little faster because Dan covered so many things that, as you'll see, are relevant to all the sections. When we talk about cooling assistance, any households that receive LIHEAP assistance to pay a share of the household's cooling bills using funds that were allocated for regular cooling assistance belong in line 2. For some states, not very many, but for some of you, cooling assistance may include households that receive cooling equipment repair and replacement on a non-emergency basis. And for those folks, those households would go in line 2 as well. We talked about consistency checks, and this is one of them. Remember that we're going to be looking at your model plan in addition to your household report to see if there's consistency. So if your model plan says you're going to have a cooling program, should you report should households be reported in the household report in line 2? And that answer is yes. We would expect to see cooling assistance households in line 2 if you said you were going to run a cooling assistance program. That being said, many of you have contingency plans in place, so you only run cooling programs, say, if there are remaining funds after the heating season, or if temperatures reach a certain level, or whatever it might be. You may indicate that you have a cooling program in your model plan, but for whatever reason, you didn't serve any households in FY 2019. We would want to see a note that explains why, and that you've seen this discrepancy, you've confirmed this discrepancy, and that and you've explained why we're not seeing those households in the report. So this is just a picture. You'll notice here at the top is your model plan in section 1, where you're checking, yes, we're doing these program components. If we see that box checked, we're going to automatically expect to see numbers in line 2 of the household report, unless we see a note explaining otherwise. As I had mentioned, many of the things that Dan talked about carry through all of the lines in this report. And so we've highlighted the slides for you, but just like heating assistance, the reporting period needs to be for the federal fiscal year, regardless of when your state program year is. We need to see an unduplicated count. So if a household came in and received cooling assistance more than once, we would only want to see them counted once in line 2. Non-emergency equipment repair and replacement, for some of you, that is part of your cooling program component and would be included in line 2, and that's outlined in slide 30. Households served with prior year funds, as Dan talked about, there are special ways to treat that, and so that's on slide 31. Households served using LIHEAP and other funds. This is that idea that a cooling assistance benefit may consist of both LIHEAP and a state fuel fund, or some other utility fund. If even $1 of LIHEAP goes into a cooling assistance benefit, it should be counted on line 2. And finally, reporting actual data in the final report. I can't underscore this enough. It's kind of an afterthought. Many of you check that estimated data box when you submit in September, and you're so excited to get your final data in that you forget to go back and uncheck that box, and it's in a few different places. So year after year, even some of the most experienced coordinators, we see that. So just keep an eye out for that, and make sure you do that at the end of your reporting.
Okay, now we're moving into crisis assistance, which is line 3A down through 3F. So crisis assistance is referring to the LIHEAP assistance that you provide to households that are facing an emergency or life-threatening situation. Each grantee gets to set their own criteria for crisis assistance, and that's defined in the model plan. And the crisis reporting in the household report should be consistent with your model plan. You'll see in the household report there are 5 different crisis assistance categories: year-round crisis, winter crisis, summer crisis. Then there's emergency furnace repair and replacement, and other crisis assistance. So we're going to talk about each of those. What if another agency administers one of your crisis assistance components? This does happen. There are grantees that don't directly capture the information about crisis assistance. Sub-grantee may be capturing it. And in that situation, you don't need to obtain the household level data from the you do need to obtain the household level data from the sub-grantees or program partners to be able to complete the household report. You'll need that to be able to report specifically for each crisis assistance component that the other organization tracks, and you need it to report your any type of LIHEAP assistance count that we're going to talk about shortly. If you have any questions about what to request or how to go about matching that with your own system, please reach out to us and we'll provide you with assistance. Okay, so year-round crisis assistance. Year-round crisis assistance, you would count any household that received that according to the criteria that you've defined in your model plan. Typically, crisis assistance that grantees count as year-round crisis assistance is emergency assistance provided throughout the year and not done on a seasonal basis. As we talked about already, if you have expedited or fast track heating assistance, you should see the prior slide, slide 27. And at the bottom of the slide, there's a few examples of year-round crisis assistance. It may be bill payment assistance that a household gets after they have been disconnected or received a notice that they will be disconnected. Or it may be an emergency fuel delivery after running out of fuel, or if a household is at imminent risk of running out of fuel. What benefits are counted for winter crisis assistance? Winter crisis assistance is generally crisis assistance provided under the same timeline as a state's heating assistance program, so generally during the winter months. Generally, winter crisis assistance is bill payment assistance after a disconnection or disconnect notice, or after running out of fuel or at imminent risk of running out of fuel during the winter. Next slide. Summer crisis assistance, again, it's based on the criteria that a grantee has defined in their model plan. Typically, summer crisis assistance is provided at the same timeline as the state's cooling assistance program, and that is generally bill payment assistance after disconnection or receipt of a disconnect notice. So again, different states offer different forms of crisis assistance, and these are just examples of what typically is classified as each of these different types. There is a line on the household report for emergency furnace repair and replacement. This is where you should report any household that received emergency home energy equipment repair or replacement using crisis funds. Generally, this includes a household that had broken or inoperable home energy equipment, and LIHEAP helped to repair or replace that equipment in an emergency situation. There is a question in your model plan, number 4.14, do you provide for equipment repair and replacement using crisis funds? So if your model plan has yes to that question, we would expect that you would have reported households on this line. Vice versa, if you've reported households, we would expect that that question would say yes in your model plan. And if you do report emergency repair and replacement households, we ask you to just include a note that describes the nature of that assistance and how many of those households also got regular crisis assistance, such as year-round or winter. There are also blank lines on the household report for reporting other crisis assistance programs that you may provide to households in your state. Other crisis assistance is if you provide emergency crisis assistance that is additional and distinct from your main crisis assistance types. So this would be separate from your winter crisis, summer crisis, year-round crisis, or the emergency equipment repair and replacement. Other crisis assistance is not intended for you to report those primary crisis categories where you're helping households to pay a bill in an emergency situation. And we really recommend that if you have a type of assistance and you're not sure exactly where to report it, that you reach out to us so we can assist you. As I mentioned, other crisis assistance can be reported on two different blank lines in the household report. We ask you to include a note if you use those lines that describes the type of assistance you're providing and alerts us if those households also receive your regular crisis assistance. Here's an example of this. So line 3E is blank when you complete the report. You'd want to enter the name of your other crisis assistance or a description of it. So in this example, it says Winter Help Program. And an example of a note you would include in the report is, in addition to Winter Crisis Assistance, we operate a separate crisis assistance program called the Winter Help Program. It provides space heaters and blankets. All 1,524 households that received this assistance also received winter crisis assistance. So as with heating assistance, the same general rules apply when you're reporting about your crisis assistance. The reporting period is still the federal fiscal year 2019. You're still expected to report an unduplicated count of households for each type of crisis assistance. And you should still report all households that received assistance with those LIHEAP funds during fiscal year 2019. Next slide. Now Melissa's going to talk about reporting weatherization.
Yes, I am. So when we talk about weatherization, we're talking about any household that received low-cost residential weatherization and other energy-related home repair with LIHEAP weatherization funds. And so many of you know in your state plan, LIHEAP weatherization can be administered in several different ways under LIHEAP rules under DOE LAP, under LIHEAP with some DOE, mostly under DOE with some LIHEAP rules. But some consistent things are that you can only use 15% of your LIHEAP funds for weatherization assistance unless you have a waiver from HHS, which allows you to increase your percentage up to 25% if it's approved. When we think about weatherization in the household report, the biggest challenge grantees face is getting data from another agency. For many of you, you have another department that administers weatherization. Some of you even have another just section within your department that administers this program, and you might have an agreement with them. And so what this means is that sometimes weatherization, in fact, many times, weatherization is tracked in a completely different system than your LIHEAP energy assistance households are. So it's very important that grantees who are in this situation obtain household level data from either your subgrantees or your program partners who get this information. And the reason for this is that at the end of the day for this report, you need to be able to identify which households received both weatherization and energy assistance, heating or cooling or crisis, in order to calculate and report the count of households that received any type of LIHEAP assistance. This means that you need some kind of unique household identifier so that you can match those households. And that Dan's going to talk about it in a second, but for some of you, that's a social security number. For some of you with maybe it's the same department, it's a case number, a household case number. There are all different kinds you can use, but it's very important that you're able to match up those households who got weatherization with those households who also got heating or cooling or crisis assistance. And we have in here, please contact Apprise if you need assistance with this. We really should put this on every slide because we are willing to help at any point in the game as you're putting together this report. And so Dan's going to talk really quickly about the kind of data that you should be collecting.
So we're again showing that picture from earlier of different elements in your data reporting system that you need to be able to complete your household report. Now, if you are a grantee that has an outside agency or a different part of your department that handles weatherization, you'd be able to get from them a count of households to report that received weatherization. But to complete other sections of the report that we're going to talk about, you need that household level information to be able to identify how many of the households that received weatherization had an elderly member, for example, and to also be able to see how many who received weatherization with LIHEAP funds received another type of LIHEAP assistance. So this is just a helpful picture or slide to think about that visually.
And we have a template, if you go back, Jorge, we have a template that we can send you with this information, but that also includes the information you would need from weatherization to report on your performance measures in the performance data form. So if you'd like a copy of this to either hand to someone who's giving you weatherization data, that's great. Even if you are using your own system and need to be able to merge kind of weatherization and energy assistance data, this can be really helpful to make sure you're collecting all of the right fields in order to do that at a later time. So if you go to the next section, just like we talked about with cooling and all the other components, we are going to be looking at your model plan to see if you said you were going to serve weatherization households, and if you've indicated that you're going to use some of your funds for weatherization program, we would expect to see households served in the household report under the weatherization assistance line. If for some reason, it's much less likely than it is with cooling or crisis or other components, but if for some reason you indicated in your model plan that you would be offering weatherization assistance, but you did not serve any households in FY 2019, we should see a note explaining why, so that we can put that in the footnotes and have a better understanding of why that discrepancy is there. And this is, once again, for those of you who are visual, the top screenshot is of the model plan. And so if you've checked that, then we would expect to see in line 4, which is the second screenshot, some households in that field. If we don't, we would expect to see a note. And if we don't see a note, we're going to call you to find out what's going on. This is a question we get a lot. If equipment repair and replacement is provided using weatherization funds, where should households that receive these services be reported? They would go under weatherization assistance. So for those of you who are really new, or for those of you who need a refresher, equipment repair and replacement can happen in 3 different ways. The least common is that you do non-emergency repair and replacement under the heating and cooling components. Not many grantees do that. There are some, though. But many of you include heating and cooling equipment repair and replacement under your crisis allocation. And so that would be under the energy assistance block of funds. And so that's where you're going to put, just like what Dan just mentioned, in the crisis section. But some of you say, look, we're not going to touch emergency repair and replacement on the energy assistance side. We just refer those all over to weatherization, and they're covered within that 15% of funds, or whatever percent of funds we're giving weatherization. That's when it goes in the weatherization field. So the best way to figure out where those equipment repair and replacement funds or households should be reported is to follow the money. What allocation is it coming out of? Is it coming out of your regular heating or cooling? Is it coming out of your crisis funds? Or is it coming out of your weatherization funds? And that's where the household should be reported. So just like before, all of those pieces of information that we talked about in heating and cooling and crisis need to be followed here as well. The reporting period, unduplicated count, households served with prior year funds, households served using LIHEAP and other funds. This is especially relevant actually in weatherization, where many funds are often leveraged to weatherize a home, and reporting actual data in the final report.
Okay. Now we are going to move outside of individual types of assistance and look at the categories that where you report on households that received LIHEAP assistance regardless of the type of assistance they received. So first we're going to look at any type of LIHEAP assistance, which is line 5. Any type of LIHEAP assistance is asking for you to report an unduplicated count of households that received any type of LIHEAP assistance. That could be regular heating assistance, cooling assistance, emergency crisis assistance, or weatherization assistance. Any type of assistance is asking you to count each household only once. And on the next slide, we're going to look at an example of this. This is the same image we showed earlier when we were talking about reporting heating assistance. Again, you have household A, household B, and household C on the left. So you have three households. Household A received heating and year-round crisis. Household B received heating, cooling, and weatherization. Household C received year-round crisis and other crisis. There's a whole different mix of assistance types they received, but it's only three households, so the unduplicated number you would report for any type of LIHEAP assistance is in the bottom row, 3 households. So the idea here is you can't add up the columns, but you have to have a way to identify households. On this slide, there's general reporting guidelines for reporting any type of LIHEAP assistance. The primary one is that you want to confirm there's no duplicate households when you're counting this statistic. The bottom 2 bullets are great checks that you can use to check the initial information you generate for this field of the report. Any type of LIHEAP assistance count should be greater than the number of households reported for each specific type of assistance in most cases. So for example, if you report 5,000 households that received heating assistance, your any type of LIHEAP assistance count should not be below 5,000. The caveat here is in parentheses. If households must receive one type of assistance before receiving any other type of LIHEAP assistance, then that won't hold true. The last bullet is another check you can use. In general, any type of LIHEAP assistance count should be less than if you added up all of the households reported for each type of assistance. So if you add up your heating assistance count to your cooling assistance to your other types of assistance. The caveat there is if you are a state that will only allow a household to receive one type of assistance per year, then your any type of LIHEAP assistance count would be equal to your sum. Line 6 is similar to any type of LIHEAP assistance, but it's asking you to report about the number of households that received bill payment assistance. So bill payment assistance, what we mean by that term is it's any household that receives a LIHEAP benefit used to pay a share of a household's energy bills and utility deposits. On the left-hand side, you can see what this includes. This is heating, cooling, or crisis assistance benefits to help pay a share of a household's energy bill or deposit, or it's households that are receiving heat and rent payments. This would not include households that received LIHEAP weatherization assistance or that received only equipment repair and replacement services. You should also not include any SNAP households that received a nominal LIHEAP benefit, and that's something we're going to talk about in a few slides. So some of the general reporting guidelines when you are reporting bill payment assistance counts are to report an unduplicated count of households that received bill payment assistance to pay a share of their energy expenses. Many grantees do allow households to receive more than one type of bill payment assistance, such as receiving both heating and crisis assistance. And if that's the case for your state, then the unduplicated count of bill payment assistance households should be less than the count the counts that you have for each separate assistance type. When you're reporting bill payment assistance, we're also asking that you keep in mind to report the unduplicated count, to not count households twice, and that if you do provide weatherization or equipment repair and replacement through LIHEAP, then you should check that your unduplicated count for bill payment assistance for line 6 is less than or equal to the amount you reported for any type of LIHEAP assistance in line 5. There is a connection here with line 5 of your household report to your performance data form you'll be submitting in the coming months. Line 6 of the household report, you report the number of households receiving bill payment assistance. And then you report this same number in Module 2 of your performance data form. In line A, you're asked to report the unduplicated number of households that receive bill payment assistance. So this is just a reminder for when you go to complete your performance data form. Now we're going to look at line 7, which is nominal payments. This is something that applies to a select number of states. Next slide. If you have, as a state, you have households that are receiving nominal LIHEAP benefits as part of a partnership with SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, then you would report the count of households that received that small nominal payment amount on this line. The minimum benefit amount for the SNAP partnership is $20.01. There's only a few states that have a separate LIHEAP payment amount for SNAP recipient households, and if you do have this, it's generally referred to as Heat or Eat or Cool or Eat. And if you have any questions, please reach out and let us know. For reporting nominal payments, again, you're reporting those SNAP households that received a small LIHEAP benefit amount. We do ask that you include a note that indicates that you provided the nominal payments and provides the benefit amount that you gave to households. And we do ask that you not include those households that received the small nominal benefit amount in your any type of assistance count that I described previously. And this is something that you can find in the instructions. And states that do provide nominal benefits must indicate that they provide those benefits in their model plan, and the field for that is 1.7a. Here is an example. In this case, they've reported households on line 7, and in the notes it says New York State issued a $21 nominal heat and eat benefit to one household in FY 2019. So this is just an example of how you would include a note if you're reporting nominal payments because of a SNAP partnership. Okay. As a reminder, when you're reporting the unduplicated counts, if you have multiple benefits for the same type of assistance, so a household got 2 or 3 or 4 heating assistance benefits, for example, you want to only count that household once when you're reporting the count of households that received heating assistance or whichever type of assistance that you are reporting. If a household received more than one type of assistance, that household would be included in the count for each type of assistance. So if my household received heating and cooling assistance, it would be counted in the heating assistance line and in the cooling assistance line. And finally, when you are calculating the number of households that received bill payment assistance or any type of LIHEAP assistance, you want to make sure that each household is counted only once when you're reporting those counts.
Okay, so I know this is a lot of information, and so we're going to stop for a moment and answer a few questions. We don't have a lot of time, but Jorge, if we got some questions in the first section or that people typed in, maybe you can pick one or two. If you have a question now or want to ask one, you can enter the text in the text box here like it's on the screen. Jorge, did we get any questions?
Yes, so we do have a couple of questions. The first one is, so when only providing expedited benefits, no separate crisis benefits, should we enter the expedited households in the crisis section?
So Dan, from my understanding of what you presented, you would ask that grantees put them both under heating and under crisis, so you're going to count them twice and put a note in the note section. Is that correct?
Yes, those are what the instructions say. If you have a specific question, I would definitely reach out to us. Those are what, but that is correct.
Then another question is, you mentioned a button to check the numbers. Where are the buttons and how are they titled?
Well, when you are entering your information in the OLDC system, when you or your coordinator goes to validate their report, the OLD system will provide warnings if there are any statistics that are questionable or don't pass one of the checks that's built into the system. So I think the question may be referring to that. If it's not, we also do have tools that we've developed to help grantees. One of them we're going to talk about later in the webinar, which is called a Check Before You Submit document, and that has a series of questions you can ask and go through your report. And if you can answer yes to all of them, you should be ready to submit your report.
Okay, we're going to save the remainder of the questions, Jorge. If you've asked a question and it didn't get answered, we'll make sure that we follow up via email. But we're going to move on, and we have about half an hour, so we may move a little bit more quickly through these next sections. Keep in mind, as always, you have the handout, and you can always get on the phone with us and talk with us if you have detailed questions about the material we're about to present. We're going to move on to section 2. This is what it looks like, and this is when we start looking at the number of assisted households by poverty interval. And so when we talk about this, we're talking about providing an unduplicated count of assisted households by poverty interval for each of the program components that we covered in section 1. And grantees must report the number of assisted households by poverty interval for each type of assistance. So every household that you put up in section 1 needs to be accounted for in section 2. This is kind of a balance, the checkbook piece. And just along those lines, the sum of households reported by poverty interval in section 2 for each type of assistance should equal the total households reported in section 1. Before we move on and I show you what this means, always make sure that what you're reporting is consistent with the income threshold defined in your state plan. So that's just an important piece to look at. If you take a look here, what we see is this is when I talk about balancing checkbooks. That's really what this is about. If I reported that 13 households got heating assistance, I should see 13 households in section 2 spread out, between poverty levels. And so for some of you, when you go and you run these numbers, you're going to see more than 13. And there may be, for example, a household that came in with 2 different income levels throughout the year, in which case you'd use the first, because you only want to, that number 13 that you reported in section 1 should match 13 households in line 1 of section 2.
For fiscal year 2019, grantees had a few different options for the criteria they could use to define income eligibility. This slide lists them. The most common is using the fiscal year 2018 HHS poverty guidelines that are in effect at the beginning of were in effect at the beginning of fiscal year 2019. You may have used state median income if a program component began later in the calendar year, like a crisis assistance, like a cooling assistance program. You may have instead used the fiscal year 2019 HHS poverty guidelines. So since grantees can use different income guidelines in determining eligibility, how should you report them in Section 2 of the Household Report? The instructions ask that you report households according to the income standard that was used at the beginning of the fiscal year, and that's the 2018 HHS poverty guidelines. Those are available at the link listed there. As I mentioned, you may have changed your income guidelines mid-year. You may have used a different standard, such as state median income, but grantees are asked by the instructions to use the 2018 HHS poverty guidelines for reporting in this section. And if some households are over the income threshold that's indicated in your model plan when you're reporting here, that's a situation where you could add a note that explains that. Next slide. So there's a 4-step process to assigning each household to one of these poverty intervals that you're asked to report on. The first is for each household, you need to collect the household's gross income, and you need to know the number of household members. When you have that information, the second step is that if that income amount represents less than 1 year, for example, you collect monthly income or 3-month income, then you need to convert that to annual gross income. The third step is you divide a household's annual gross income by the dollar amount that is equal to 100% of the 2018 poverty guidelines based on that household size. Then you multiply that by 100 and you round it to the nearest whole number percent, and you then know that household's poverty level using the 2018 guidelines. Next slide. So this is an example. I won't go through it for time, but if you work with different staff that have to be able to do this, this is a helpful slide to provide to them. In this example, the household gets classified to the 126% to 150% poverty, and that's at the bottom of the slide. So there are situations that can occur where information is missing and a household doesn't have income information. In general, you should have that information for your households. But if that rare situation comes up, the guidance below is to report those households in the highest poverty interval in Section 2, and to add a note that explains that, for example, 2 households were missing income information. Next slide. Now we're going to move on to Section 3, which is looking at the number of assisted households by vulnerable population.
Yeah, and before we move on, when we talk about poverty intervals, one of the questions we get a lot is having to do with categorical eligibility. So if you are serving households with using categorical eligibility that puts them over, for example, the LIHEAP, the federal LIHEAP income threshold, for example, how you're using food stamp income, which can be net versus gross, can result in really high income levels. It's important to note that as well. And if you need help figuring out where to put those households, give us a call. So this is going through Section 3, which is looking at vulnerable populations. If you want to go to the next slide, when we look at the LIHEAP statute, there are 3 separate vulnerability groups: households with 1 or more elderly members, households with 1 or more disabled members, and households with 1 or more young children. Now, two of these particular, you can go to the next slide, two of these are defined. Elderly is defined as a person 60 years or older, and young child is defined as a person age 5 years or under. But a disabled household member is not defined by the statute. States need to decide who they'll count as disabled based on their own definitions, and these run the gamut. Some of you use whether or not they're receiving disability insurance, permanent disability, or even just self-declared in some cases. So what's really important here is that you have something in your system or something in your subgrantee system or something in your partners, including weatherization system, that allows you to go in and count these households at the end of the season. So it should be collected as part of the application and intake process. People should be able to either report their age, when you're looking at senior households, or check senior, same with disabled and same with young children. You'd store this data in your management system, and then you'd have an indicator field for each vulnerable member type to mark whether or not it contains a vulnerable member. So we showed you earlier that kind of reporting template that you could use with your subgrantees or your partners, and in there includes a yes/no field for each of these three vulnerable categories. We have a fourth bullet here that says create an indicator to mark whether a household contains any of the three. You can do that, although many of you would just have your program analyst or your IT person create something in the background that says if any of the three vulnerable categories are checked, then this household would be counted as someone with one or more of the vulnerable status.
As with the other household counts that you report in the household report, you're asked to report an unduplicated count of households with vulnerable members. A household should be counted in the vulnerable member categories if any member meets the vulnerable population definition. So it does not need to be the primary applicant. You should report the number of assisted households for each type of assistance with a vulnerable member for each type of assistance that you report in Section 1. So if you report 500 households getting cooling assistance in Section 1, it would be expected that you would have households in Section 3 for cooling assistance for the different vulnerable population that Melissa discussed. Next slide. So column D, that's in the red rectangle, is one of the trickier parts of the household report. You can see column A, you're reporting on elderly households, column B, households with a disabled member, and column C, households with a young child 5 years or younger. But column D is asking you to report the count of households with one of those three, two of those three, all three of those vulnerabilities. So for column D, you're asked to report an unduplicated count for each type of assistance with at least one vulnerable member. And you should not add up across the columns by adding elderly plus disabled plus young child. The reason for that is that a household can have more than one of those types of vulnerabilities. So you need to be able to produce an unduplicated count of households across those categories. Here's an example with 4 households. If one household has an elderly member and a disabled member, one household has a disabled member and a young child, one household an elderly member, and one household a disabled member. It's 4 different households. They have a different mix of characteristics, but each of them has a vulnerable household member. So you can see column D, you report 4, but if you had instead added column A plus B plus C, you'd receive 6, and that would be incorrect. So you need the unduplicated count of households here. The last line in Section 3 is reporting any type of LIHEAP assistance by vulnerability. The guidelines for reporting line 5 of Section 3 are the same as for reporting any type of LIHEAP assistance in Section 1. So you should refer back to that slide if you review these slides later and have questions about reporting this. But in general, the number reported in any type of LIHEAP assistance in this section, Section 3, should be less than the number reported for any type of LIHEAP assistance in Section 1, and that's because of serving households that have no vulnerable members. We are approaching the end, so we're going to stop and take maybe one question, Jorge, and then we'll finish up with some resources and take additional questions at the end.
We don't have any questions for now, so we can answer, any questions that come up in the remaining time at the end.
Okay. Okay, so we are going to do another poll question. So if you could please take a look at this, and for this question you can select all that apply. So the question is for reporting on the assisted households that received LIHEAP assistance. What information do you need for each household to be able to report that in the household report? Give it another 5 seconds. Okay. For this question, you do need to be able to know the types of assistance each household received. It's great. You do need to know each household's poverty level to complete Section 2. And you do need to know if a household had vulnerable members for Section 3. For the amounts of assistance received, you don't need to know that specifically for the household report, whether a household received a $5 benefit in heating assistance or a $200 benefit, for example. So this is helpful, and I think we can move on to some resources and reminders.
So we're going to have Jorge. What you'll notice quick is that he's going to be speeding through up until the resources and reminders section. So while he's doing that, I'm just going to tell you that topic 4 and 5 and 6 cover applicant households and optional reporting. I want to point out that the applicant households can be a little bit tricky. Each state has their own definition of how they fit this in. Now, applicant households include households that did receive LIHEAP and those that applied but didn't receive LIHEAP. So there are some states that don't even put households into the system until they've applied, and they don't apply until they've been pre-screened. So in some states, you may only be counting within the applicant households those that were denied or voided at a later date, whereas some of you keep track of everyone that applies, regardless of whether they get assistance or not. And so it's a good idea to figure out what you've been reporting in the past if you're new, what you want to report in that section, and to make sure you're being consistent about it. And once again, we can help you with all of these things if you go through later and have questions. So final reminders. We'll go to the next slide. There are no changes to the 2019 household report. The requirements are the same as last year. The final household report is due in OLDC on December 16th. If you need extra time to get it done and get it done right, you need to contact your OCS liaison and get permission for an extension. That's really important. Remember that the household report must be entered, saved, certified, and submitted in OLDC, and that can take some time. So if you're like me and you wait till the last minute to do everything, keep in mind that you may not meet the deadline given that there are all these kind of extra steps. So kind of plan out what you're going to need and when you need to have things done. Several validation checks are programmed into OLDC. Once again, as Dan mentioned, these can be warning errors. So this is data that could be correct, but we want you to double check it. And if you get a warning message and you've double checked and it is the right data, this should automatically trigger you to put a note in the note section. Because when a prize goes through and does their own validation, when a warning pops up and they don't see a note as to why there's a discrepancy, they're going to call you. So just use that warning message as a trigger that you need to be putting in a note about it. Fatal error messages aren't going to let you move on. So if they're inconsistent data that must be corrected before you submit your household report, it's going to show up as a fatal error. If you get a warning message, but you have an explanation, once again, you want to put a note in there. If you have a warning message and you don't know how to resolve it or to confirm that the data is correct, contact a prize. And the same thing with a fatal error. Some of you get them and you're like, I don't understand why this is wrong, or I've checked my data, it's right, or I don't even know how to check my data to see. Contact us, we'll work together with you. Do not, I can just remember my first couple of years, I spent hours trying to figure out one number and why it was wrong, and I wish I had had a prize to call and just say, look, can you talk me through this? It would have saved me so much time. So don't wait, just call us and we'll walk you through it.
Once you submit your household report, we will review it and email you if there are any potential questions or issues. The idea is to help you to be able to complete and finalize your report so that information can be used in the report to Congress and published in the data warehouse. When your report is confirmed to be complete, your liaison will accept it, and that's the information that will be used. And if you later identify a correction or a change, you can submit a revision in OLDC using the revision option. These are some links to different resources. The top one is the 2018 Poverty Guidelines that you would use for Section 2 of the Household Report. The Household Report AT and instructions from 2018 and past years can be found at this link in the middle. And then you can view your own state's or other states' household report data in the data warehouse on the Performance Management website. We have developed a document that I mentioned earlier called the Check Before You Submit document, and that has just a series of questions to help you to assess your report and determine if it's ready to be submitted. You can find it at this link on the Performance Management website, and we encourage you to take a look at that and to use it as you complete your report. Here are some different resources for using OLDC. The OLDC system is accessed through Grant Solutions. You can log in at grantsolutions.gov/GS. Once you're logged in the top taskbar, you can access the OLDC homepage. And if you need assistance with using OLDC, you can contact the Grants Center of Excellence help desk. As Kate mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is the first of two related to the fiscal year 2019 household report. The reminder webinar is on Tuesday, November 19th at 3 o'clock. It'll be a short 30-minute webinar that highlights the main items that we talked about during this webinar. And if you're welcome to attend, if it would be helpful, or to recommend it to others on your staff. And we will also be having webinars coming up in December and January on completing the fiscal year 2019 performance data form. Here are some last resources at the bottom. You can see the team at a prize and Melissa's contact information. please reach out to us if we can be of assistance. Okay, so now we have some time for questions.
So, Dan, do we have another quick poll?
Oh yes, we do. Let's do the poll, Jorge.
Yeah. So I can go ahead and read it. We kind of want to see if this webinar helped. I know it's a lot of information, but do you feel more confident after this webinar in completing even just one section of the report? Do you feel better? And so we asked you at the beginning how confident you are, and so now we want to know how confident you are now in your ability to complete the household report. Very confident, somewhat confident, not too confident, and not at all confident. Great. Well, we moved some people up from those bottom up into the top two, very confident and somewhat confident. For those people who feel like you're still, a little bit iffy on some areas, once again, if there's one thing you take away, it's that there's help out there for you. Don't hesitate to call with any questions, and we'll sit down and walk you through things. So now I think we want to go ahead and take questions. Before we take questions, we do these webinars every year, and I'd really encourage you, if you have suggestions for us about how we can improve them or make them more meaningful, to give us a call and contact us. We really welcome that. We want to make these as effective as we can. So with that, Jorge, do we have any questions?
Yes, we have a couple of questions. The first one is, do we plan to go over the short form?
Well, this webinar and the next one are focused on the long form. The short form asks for similar information about to Section 1, so you can consult the portion of this webinar in Section 1 to help with completing that section, but there's not specifically a webinar that's going to focus on the short form.
And then another question is, this is more a comment, it would be helpful to have a hard copy to look at and make notes on, like a handout. And I just wanted to remind everyone that there's the slides can be downloaded. So I don't know if that's what the person who was asking had in mind, but you can download it in the handout section of GoToWebinar, or you can email us and we can send those to you.
I do think, so the slides are there, but also I think in the future that's a good suggestion that we maybe have a hard copy of the report itself to accompany the slides, so that if people want to put notes directly on the report, that might be helpful. So it's a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, Jorge?
So one last question. What do we do if a household's information changed during the year? For example, their income went up or down?
That is a very good question. That does happen. So you may have a household that received heating assistance early in the fiscal year during the winter, and then received cooling assistance later on in the summer, and their income amount as a household changed during that time. Or it may be they received a heating assistance and another heating assistance, and their income changed. The instructions advise you to use their information at the initial point that they applied. So in that example I just gave, if they had two heating assistance benefits, and the income amount at each point was slightly different, you would take the initial income amount and use that for calculating their poverty interval.
Okay, no more questions for now. Great.
Thank you all for attending. If you think of questions as you consider this webinar, don't hesitate to reach out. Once again, we'll be having another webinar next week over last-minute reminders, and you're welcome to join us for that as well. But thank you all, and I hope you all have a great rest of the week.
Yes, thank you for your time. Have a great day.